In a land of welcome. Abraham went there because of the famine in Canaan, as did Jacob and his son Joseph later on. It was also a land of asylum, attracting many political refugees. They always had relations with Egypt. Sometimes those relations were complicated, sometimes they were simple, but there were no real ideological issues, because in fact, there was not much talk in the Bible of the gods of Egypt. So what is important with Egypt is that it was constantly in the minds of all the biblical authors.
Joseph's story in Egypt begins at the end of Genesis, the first book of the Bible. Sold by his brothers to caravan drivers on their way to Egypt, he was bought by an officer and introduced into the Pharaoh's court, where he became the Grand Vizier. The Bible tells the story of his remarkable fate. In powerful and centralized Egypt, where royal propaganda played a critical role, nothing went unrecorded. Everything relating to the administrative functioning of the empire was noted down, from major events to the state's day-to-day running. Does this huge collection of hieroglyphics contain any clues as to Joseph's power, or at least the presence of the Israelites in Egypt? In order to answer that question, our investigators have to go to Egypt. Silberman is in the country that all archaeologists dream about. A millennial civilization, magnificently preserved monuments. And in the heart of Cairo, an obligatory visit for our historian, an imperial building placed under the auspices of Champollion, the man who unraveled the mysteries of the hieroglyphics. He'll be meeting here with Jean-Pierre Cotigiani, a French Egyptologist.
When you look at a map of Egypt, it's obvious that it couldn't be anywhere else. In any case, you have the Suez Canal here, what is known as the Suez Canal today.
The Bible tells a very clear story of Jacob's family coming down to Egypt at a time of famine. Are there other important sources in Egyptian inscriptions and pictures of people from Canaan coming down to Egypt in a time of famine?
Certain people built careers there, people who held important positions. So the story of Joseph becoming a minister in the Pharaoh's service is quite plausible. I prefer not to use the word Pharaoh because we should really say King of Egypt. As you know, the word Pharaoh comes from the Bible. The Egyptians themselves never called their kings pharaohs, except very late in the period. In any case, there were people in the king's entourage who were Semites, who had been naturalized. They took on Egyptian names, and some of them built brilliant careers there.
Paintings in the ancient necropolis of Beni Hassan show Semites who had come to Egypt, most likely for trade reasons.
These show details of women with dresses that are not at all Egyptian, with these patterns here. The faces are quite typical of how the Egyptians saw the Semites, with long pointy beards and thicker hair.
But traders were not the only ones attracted to Egypt. The land of Canaan was subject to very dry seasons and irregular rainfalls, resulting in frequent famines. Herders and farmers had no other choice but to go to Egypt to work as laborers and take advantage of a more hospitable land. That hospitality was a gift of the Nile, a river that is both the soul of Egypt and its life source. Throughout biblical antiquity, Egypt acted as a magnet for those who came from arid lands, a land of refuge that was a source of fascination, as are most lands of plenty.
So how do we go from the story of Joseph, who was doing so well in Egypt, to the description of Egypt we find at the beginning of the book of Exodus, where suddenly Israel finds itself in a situation of oppression and slavery? This transition, in fact, occurs at the end of Joseph's story, because Joseph sends for Jacob and all his family. And in fact, it's the Israelites who expanded and grew in number. The book of Exodus opens with the following finding. A new Pharaoh came to power who no longer knew Joseph or what he had achieved. So all of a sudden, the picture changes, and we find ourselves in a state of oppression. On the one hand, the Egyptians wanted to retain their workers, but at the same time, they were afraid. They tried all sorts of methods to get rid of them, as is related in the biblical text. Or the more we oppress them, the more they are fruitful and multiply.
The Bible refers to the names of two cities that the Israelites apparently built, Pithom and Ramses. Egyptian documents confirm that a city by the name of Pi-Ramses was built in the Nile Delta in the 13th century BC, under Pharaoh Ramses II. From the 1920s onwards, archaeological missions began looking for the remains of that city, located east of the Delta in Kontir. The Bible suggests the existence of significant imperial monuments. However, researchers have been disappointed by the results. The city of Ramses does in fact appear to have existed, but very few vestiges have been found.
Who was this king?
Ramses II.
Today, the site has once again become farming land. But archaeologists have succeeded in finding the solution to the enigma. The city of Ramses was abandoned just after its construction when one of the branches of the Nile dried up. A few decades later, its monuments were taken apart and the stones were reused in the construction of a new capital, Tanis, situated a few dozen kilometers away. So far, nothing appears to contradict the fact that Ramses II was the impressive builder pharaoh that we read about in the Bible. The same Ramses II that Moses pleaded with in the name of God and his ancestors to let his people go. In the Bible, the life of Moses begins as in a myth. His mother set him afloat in the river Nile in order to escape the authorities' order of death of all firstborn Israelites. He was taken in by the Pharaoh's daughter and raised as an Egyptian noble. One day he saw an Egyptian strike an Israelite slave. He killed him and fled to the desert. There, the God of Israel ordered him to free his people and to guide them to the Promised Land. After hesitating for a while, he accepted the mission and returned to the court to impose the will of the God of Israel on the Pharaoh.
Moses defied the Pharaoh. What did that defiance symbolize? It showed that Yahweh, the God who sent Moses to the Pharaoh, was more powerful than all that the king of Egypt symbolized. When Moses came to see the Pharaoh asked who this God Yahweh was. He had never heard of him and considered him as the minor god of an Oriental people that was of no consequence. But little by little, he realized that this Yahweh was in fact more powerful than the whole of the Egyptian pantheon.
But the Pharaoh continued in his refusal. As a result, Egypt was struck by the 10 plagues. These plagues forced the Pharaoh to change his mind and let the Israelites go.
According to the biblical story, the children of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Sukkoth, about 600,000 on foot that were men, not counting children.
The Israelites left Egypt in the middle of the night and crossed the Red Sea. The Egyptian army was swallowed up in its waters. Moses liberated an enslaved people from under the yoke of a great empire. So much for the story. But what of the historical facts? According to the text, the Exodus occurred 480 years before the construction of Solomon's temple, that is, in the 15th century BC. But the reference in the Bible to a city by the name of Pi-Ramses led researchers to place the Exodus in the 13th century at the earliest, a period where we find the first pharaohs bearing the name Ramses. An archaeological vestige held by the Museum of Cairo makes it possible to determine a chronology for the Exodus on the basis of historical data. It was discovered in 1896 in the funerary temple of Ramses II's son, Pharaoh Meneptah. The stele describes the military campaign led by Meneptah against Canaan. It provides a list of the cities and people that were fought and conquered.
At line 27, at the very bottom of the stele, we find a word that corresponds exactly with that of Israel. Israel is destroyed and its seed is no more. It is this idea of a community, of a people, that is rendered in the hieroglyph of the man and the woman, the determinative with the plural, which is therefore Israel. It is the only reference to Israel in the whole of Egyptian literature. be it historical, religious, or literary, that we are aware of. Only once is Israel mentioned in all the Egyptian texts, whereas the Bible refers to Misraim or Egypt about 700 times.
An actual reference then, albeit the only one we have. We know the date at which the stele was erected, 1207 BC. At that time, Israel was already established in Canaan, so the Exodus could not have occurred before this date. So to summarize, Semites were definitely to be found in Egypt. Pharaoh Ramses II was the father of Merneptah, and the 13th century seems to be a plausible time period. If we leave aside errors in the chronology of the Bible, the Exodus therefore could have occurred. What was the itinerary that was taken? The Bible tells us that in order to flee, the children of Israel had the choice of two routes, one in the north, which was direct, and one in the south, which crossed a mountainous desert. Which one did they choose? In order to find out, Neil Silberman is going to meet with Donald Redford, an Egyptologist who is specialized in the Bible, at his excavation in Mendes in the Delta.
Hi, Don.
Hi, Neil.
Great to see you.
Good to see you. How was the trip?
Terrific.
Oh, that's great. We expected you a bit earlier, but
well,
the best laid plans, I guess.
I guess. I hear you're having a great season here.
Oh, yes. This is one of the best. I'd like to show you the site. Shall we go and see it?
Love to. Just in the places where the Bible describes the exodus of the Israelites as they left Egypt, were there fortifications? Was there a military presence there that would have encountered these fleeing Israelites?
Oh, yes. All over the eastern delta and in the Sinai and up in the Negev and further north, there were permanent Egyptian garrisons and garrison points, checkpoints. In fact, the Bedou were constantly under watch by the Egyptian paramilitary police along the borders.
A carving at the Karnak Temple attests to the existence of a sophisticated system of garrisons that ensured the logistics of a route that followed the north coast of Sinai. It was a strategic route for the Egyptians that led into Mesopotamia and Anatolia. A fleeing multitude could not have taken it without being spotted and stopped by one of its garrisons. This left them with the southern and more arid route, the one that is most in keeping with the biblical story. The Bible tells how, after having camped in the desert for almost 3 months, the Israelites received the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai. They then headed off towards the northeast to the land of Canaan. At that point, the biblical text tells us, they reached the oasis of Kadesh Barnea, located between the Sinai and Negev deserts. It is here that they spent many years after refusing to enter the Holy Land. The oasis was thoroughly excavated during the 1950s and 1970s. No remains from the 13th century, which is believed to be the period of the Exodus, were found at the site. Modern archaeological techniques enable us to pinpoint the tiniest remains left behind by simple herdsmen, and yet no trace of the Israelites' long stay in the area is to be found. The absence of any evidence of their journey through the wilderness in either this oasis or anywhere else in the Sinai Peninsula is one of the enigmas of the Exodus story.
How can you explain the possibility of such a large group as described in the Exodus story actually going out of Egypt? Is that possible?
Well, I couldn't explain it. Nothing of that shows up in the archaeological or textual record. And one might argue that's an argument from silence, admittedly, but nonetheless, we know so much about that period that not to find even a single blip on the radar screen, as it were, it would be fatal to that theory. Moreover, the biblical account has 600,000 weapon-bearing males leaving Egypt in the Exodus. That would probably translate into 2 million souls. Can you imagine 2 million people leaving a country of the size of Egypt, which had only a population of 3.5 million at the time? That would have made a huge hole in the social and economic system that certainly would have shown up in the records. It would have resulted almost immediately in a downsizing economically and socially that would certainly have disrupted the empire irreparably. Nothing of that sort is found in the record, not a thing. I couldn't see the Exodus as described in the Bible as occurring in the 13th century.
So we're talking about something that isn't quite history, but there are a number of specific geographical terms. Can they give us any clue to when this was written?
The geographical clues can, in fact, help to date the person who put this down. That's true. When one does that, one comes up with a fairly good impression of what the writer knew and the geography that he was familiar with. And that would help to plug him in terms of chronology. When did he live? Yes.
When was that time?
Well, Pithom, as I say, has been identified as the city called Per Atum, the House of Atum. This was built by Pharaoh Necho II around 600 BC, certainly not before 605 BC. That's one item. Going out of Egypt, you have such names as Etam, Pi Hahirot, Baal Tzafon. All of these are known from the later geography of Egypt. They weren't around, many of them, in the New Kingdom when the story is supposed to have taken place. I would see the Saite period, what we call the Saite, that's the 26th dynasty from 664 to 525 BC, as a period, a kind of an optimal period for the general background of the story as we have it in Exodus. At any rate, we've limited it to 7th, 6th centuries before Christ.
So, as in our investigation of the patriarchs, both the clues gathered in the field and the texts point in the same direction. Certain stories, including the Exodus, started to be written down in the 7th century BC. Silberman has returned to Megiddo. He is discussing these new elements with Israel Finkelstein. Whatever the possible historical sources that inspired the Exodus saga, the story does not describe the Egypt of the 13th century BC. The investigation of this biblical story once again leads us to the 7th century. What were the reasons for writing down this text at that time? We have to broaden our historical perspective. In the 9th century and during most of the 8th century, Canaan was divided into two kingdoms, Israel and Judah. These kingdoms were located between two of the greatest empires of the Near East. In the south, Egypt, whose power and might we have seen evidence of. Canaan was obviously a strategic area for this immemorial kingdom, which had significant regional ambitions. And in the northeast, Assyria, the great Mesopotamian empire of the time. In its desire for regional hegemony, it was obviously and aggressively one of Egypt's rivals. Israel and Judah, these twin kingdoms would ultimately be caught up in that rivalry. But they would not share the same destiny.
In the late 8th century BC, the Assyrians show on the scene. They wipe out the northern kingdom, take over its territory. Torrent of refugees come to the south, to Jerusalem, to Judah. And that puts a heavy burden on the people of Judah and Jerusalem, because now they are the only Israelite nation left.
Our investigation will now move to Jerusalem, capital of the Kingdom of Judah. It is here that the biblical stories of Egypt, Moses, and the Exodus into the desert would be woven during the 7th century. Unraveling those stories is no mean feat and requires careful analysis. Jerusalem is a city of hundreds of thousands of inhabitants. Each man and woman, and also each stone, carries the weight of a sacred story. Undertaking excavations here is quite a challenge. Nevertheless, surprising discoveries have been made thanks to the determination of archaeologists.
This wall was built in the late 8th century BC in the time of King Hezekiah. At that time, Jerusalem grew dramatically in population and in size, 10 times bigger than before, in a matter of 25, 30 years, 40 years, something like that. And that was because of the torrent of refugees who came from the north after the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel by the Assyrians, came to Judah and settled here. And this area, which was outside the old city of the Bronze and Iron Age, became populated. And then, because of the Assyrian threat, Hezekiah decided to fortify it. And he built this huge fortification, huge wall, to surround the new quarter in the western hill of Jerusalem.
During the reign of this king, Hezekiah, Jerusalem underwent a metamorphosis. From a modest town of 6 hectares, the city was transformed